75 years. That's how long Beatrice had walked this earth. She had built a life, a business, and a considerable fortune. She'd raised 2 children, Richard and Karen, who now had children of their own. But in all those years, Beatrice had never felt the spark of true, uninhibited joy. Her late husband had been a business partner, their marriage more of a merger than a romance. Now, in the twilight of her life, she felt a profound loneliness, surrounded by possessions but starved of connection. Her children, unfortunately, only seemed to see her as a walking, talking bank account. Their visits were transactional, their affection conditional. They'd circle like vultures, dropping hints about their inheritance, complaining about their own financial strains, always with an eye on her wealth. Beatrice felt like the goose that laid the golden eggs, and they were just waiting for her to stop laying so they could have the whole goose. Then, one sunny afternoon at a local art gallery, everything changed. Beatrice was admiring a vibrant abstract painting when a man's voice, warm and rich like coffee, spoke beside her. "It speaks to you, doesn't it?" She turned to see a man with kind eyes and a gentle smile. He introduced himself as Mateo, the artist. He was younger, perhaps in his late 50s, with a passion for life that was infectious. They talked for hours, not about business or money, but about color, passion, and dreams. For the first time in decades, Beatrice felt seen, not for her bank balance, but for her soul. A friendship blossomed, quickly and unexpectedly turning into a deep, heartfelt love. Mateo made her laugh. He'd take her on spontaneous trips to the coast. They'd paint together in his sun-drenched studio, and they'd dance in her living room to old records. Beatrice felt like she was 17 again, her world bursting with color, all thanks to Mateo. When Beatrice introduced Mateo to her children, the reaction was exactly as she'd feared. Richard, ever the pragmatist, was cold and dismissive. Karen was even worse, her smile thin and brittle. "Mother," Karen had said, pulling her aside, "are you sure about this? A man his age, with an artist's income? You have to be careful. People can be very persuasive when they smell money." The accusation was clear. Mateo was a gold digger. Richard followed up with his own brand of concern, suggesting Beatrice get a full psychological evaluation. "We're just worried you're not in your right mind, Mom," he'd said, his voice dripping with false sympathy. Their concern was a thinly veiled panic. Their inheritance was, in their minds, being threatened by a charming painter. The children's campaign to break them up began. They started with subtle tactics. They'd accidentally schedule family events when they knew Mateo had an art class. They'd make backhanded comments about his paintings or his bohemian lifestyle. When that didn't work, they escalated. Richard hired a private investigator to dig up dirt on Mateo. The report came back disappointingly clean. Mateo was exactly who he said he was. A moderately successful artist who lived a simple, contented life. Undeterred, Karen tried a different approach. She staged an intervention, bringing a lawyer to discuss protecting Beatrice's assets. The lawyer droned on about prenuptial agreements and trusts, all while Richard and Karen nodded along grimly. Beatrice sat through it all, a storm of anger and disappointment brewing inside her. These were her children, yet they treated her like a doddering old fool, incapable of making her own decisions. They didn't care about her happiness. They only cared about her money. The final straw came one evening when Beatrice overheard Richard and Karen talking in the kitchen. They thought she was upstairs resting. "We have to get him out of the picture," Karen whispered fiercely. "What if she marries him? He could take everything." Richard's voice was low and calculating. "I've been talking to Dr. Evans. He thinks we might have a case for conservatorship. If we can prove she's mentally unfit, we can take control of her finances. It's for her own good." Hearing those words was like a physical blow. Her own children were plotting to have her declared incompetent, to strip her of her autonomy, all for the sake of their inheritance. The betrayal was absolute. In that moment, something inside Beatrice snapped. The quiet, accommodating mother was gone, replaced by a woman who was finally ready to fight for her own life. She walked back upstairs, her heart heavy but her resolve like steel. She knew what she had to do. A few days later, Beatrice and Mateo went for a walk on the beach, the place where they'd shared so many happy moments. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. With the sound of the waves crashing on the shore, Beatrice turned to Mateo. "Marry me," she said, her voice clear and strong. Mateo looked at her, his expression a mixture of surprise and adoration. He took her hands in his. "Beatrice, I love you more than words can say. But are you sure? Your children?" Beatrice smiled, a genuine, liberating smile. "My children have made their choices. Now I'm making mine. I choose you. I choose happiness." He didn't hesitate. He pulled her into a loving embrace and said yes. They decided on a small, intimate wedding, just a few close friends at her beautiful home. Beatrice sent out the invitations, including 2 addressed to Richard and Karen. She knew they would come. They wouldn't miss a chance to witness what they believed was their mother's biggest mistake. The wedding day was perfect. Beatrice wore a stunning cream-colored dress, and she looked radiant, happier than anyone had ever seen her. Mateo stood by her side, his love for her evident in every glance. Richard and Karen stood in the back, their faces grim masks of disapproval. They watched as their mother exchanged vows, their minds lightly calculating how much of their inheritance was vanishing with every word. After the ceremony, during the small reception in her garden, Beatrice stood up to give a toast. She raised her glass, her eyes twinkling. "I want to thank you all for being here to celebrate this incredible day with me and Mateo," she began, her voice ringing with newfound confidence. "It's a day of new beginnings for me, in more ways than one." She paused and looked directly at Richard and Karen. Their expressions were tense with anticipation. "As many of you know, I have been blessed with considerable wealth in my life. And I know my children have been concerned about its future." She took a sip of champagne, savoring the moment. "Well, you don't have to worry anymore. I have made my final decision. Effective today, my entire financial estate will be transferred into a new charitable foundation." A collective gasp went through the small crowd. Richard and Karen's faces went from pale to ashen. "The Beatrice Arts Foundation," she continued, "will be dedicated to supporting emerging artists, just like my wonderful husband." She beamed at Mateo, who looked at her with pure astonishment. He had no idea this was coming. "It will provide grants, scholarships, and spaces for creativity to flourish for generations to come. It's the legacy I choose to leave behind." Then she turned her gaze back to her children, her expression softening just a little. "But Richard, Karen, I haven't forgotten you. I'm leaving you something as well. Something far more valuable than money." Her lawyer stepped forward and handed each of them a small, beautifully wrapped box. With trembling hands, they opened them. Inside Richard's box was his grandfather's old, worn pocket watch, the one he'd always admired as a child. Inside Karen's was a delicate locket containing a tiny photo of Beatrice as a young mother, holding Karen as a baby. Sentimental items, memories. They were priceless, yet in their eyes, worthless. The message was unmistakable. They stared at the objects, then at their mother, their faces a mixture of shock, fury, and utter disbelief. Karen was the first to speak, her voice shaking with rage. "You can't do this. He put you up to this. He's a con artist." Beatrice held up a hand, silencing her. "Actually, there's one more thing you should know." She looked at Mateo, her eyes filled with love and a little bit of mischief. "My dear children, in your frantic attempt to investigate Mateo, you seem to have missed one crucial detail. You saw an artist and assumed he was poor. You never bothered to look into his family." She paused for dramatic effect. "Allow me to introduce you to Mateo. His full name is Mateo de la Cruz. His family owns one of the largest and most successful architectural firms in South America. In fact, my darling husband is independently wealthier than I have ever been." The silence in the garden was absolute. Richard and Karen were frozen, their mouths slightly agape. The gold digger was richer than the gold. Their entire scheme, their cruelty, their betrayal, it was all based on a false assumption. A prejudice they never bothered to question. They had not been trying to protect their mother. They had been trying to protect their own greed. And in the process, they had lost everything. Beatrice took Mateo's hand. "We're going to travel," she said, her voice filled with excitement. "We're going to paint and laugh and see the world. I'm finally free." And as she looked at her new husband, then at the stunned faces of her children, Beatrice knew she had given them the greatest inheritance of all. A lesson. A lesson about love, about assumptions, and about the true meaning of wealth. For Beatrice, her new life had just begun. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more. We'll see you in the next one.